Part 1 At the arrival of the butcher bird. In the autumn skies over Western Europe in 1941, the air war was changing in ways few pilots immediately understood. For months the Royal Air Force had begun to believe that the balance in the sky was shifting in their favor. The German Luftwaffe's once dominant Messerschmitt Bf 109 was beginning to meet its equal in newer Allied fighters. British Spitfires had grown faster, stronger, more confident. Rough pilots flying patrol over the English Channel felt the subtle shift of momentum. But then, without warning, a new silhouette began appearing above the clouds, a short-winged, muscular, compact, with a blunt radial engine and the posture of a predator. It looked nothing like the slender fighters that had dominated the skies before. This aircraft did not glide elegantly. It stalked. The first combat encounters shocked British pilots. The aircraft was the Focke-Wulf Fw 190, designed by the brilliant German engineer Kurt Tank. Rough pilots initially struggled even to identify it. It could climb rapidly, dive with terrifying acceleration, and turn with surprising agility despite its heavy construction. Its radial engine gave it a thick nose and a menacing presence in the air, and its armament of multiple cannons mounted in wings and fuselage could tear apart enemy aircraft in seconds. British pilots soon gave it a grim nickname, the Butcher Bird. In dogfights over the Channel, the Fw 190 seemed almost unfair. It could outroll the Spitfire V, out-accelerate it, and disengage whenever the German pilot chose. The Luftwaffe suddenly possessed a fighter that dominated the mid-altitude battlefield. Reports flooded RAF Command describing a mysterious new German aircraft that could appear from nowhere, strike violently, and vanish before British fighters could respond. For many RAF pilots, the first encounter with the Fw 190 ended not in combat glory, but in confusion and retreat. What made the aircraft so deadly was not just its speed or firepower. It was the philosophy behind its design. Kurt Tank did not create a fragile racing machine meant only for perfect weather and expert pilots. He designed a war machine built to survive brutal conditions. The Fw 190 was rugged, heavily armored, and remarkably forgiving to fly. Its wide landing gear made takeoffs easier than the notoriously tricky Bf 109. Its cockpit visibility gave pilots a clearer view of the battlefield. It was an aircraft built not just for races, but for war. And in the vast furnace of World War II, that distinction mattered. The arrival of the Fw 190 did more than introduce a new fighter. It shattered the illusion that the Allies had gained control of the skies. Across occupied Europe, German fighter units began replacing older aircraft with this new machine. Pilots quickly learned its strengths: brutal acceleration, devastating firepower, and the ability to dictate the terms of combat. If the enemy fought, the Fw 190 could kill them. If the enemy resisted, it could simply disappear. In the dark calculus of aerial warfare, the Fw 190 represented something terrifyingly efficient, a predator perfectly adapted to the environment of total war. Part 2A Kurt Tank and the birth of the war machine. Long before the Fw 190 roared into combat, its story began inside German design offices where engineers wrestled with a simple but difficult question: how could a fighter aircraft dominate the unpredictable chaos of modern air combat? Kurt Tank believed the answer was not elegance, but power and resilience. Unlike many designers of the era who pursued lightweight aerodynamic purity, Tank believed fighters needed to survive punishment. Air combat in World War II was brutal and unforgiving. Pilots flew through flak bursts, endured violent maneuvers, and returned with bullet holes scattered across their aircraft. A fighter that looked perfect on paper might fail under those realities. So Tank approached the design of the Fw 190 with a different philosophy. Instead of an inline engine like the Bf-109 or Spitfire, he selected a radial engine of the BMW 801. Radial engines were larger and less aerodynamic, but they were tougher. They could absorb damage and continue running even after taking hits that would destroy more delicate engines. That thick, circular nose would become one of the aircraft's most recognizable features. But the engine alone did not define the Fw-190. Tank engineered the aircraft around the needs of the pilot. The cockpit was spacious for its time, with excellent visibility that allowed pilots to see threats approaching from multiple angles. Controls were designed to be responsive and intuitive, allowing rapid maneuvers during high-speed combat. German pilots quickly discovered that the aircraft could roll faster than almost anything else in the sky. That roll rate became a lethal advantage. In aerial combat, the ability to change direction instantly could mean the difference between life and death. While many aircraft relied on turning performance, the Fw-190 excelled in rapid roll maneuvers that allowed it to reposition its guns faster than opponents could react. The aircraft was also heavily armed. Early versions carried 2 machine guns above the engine and 4 cannons mounted in the wings. When those weapons fired together, the result was devastating. A brief burst could tear apart bombers or fighters with brutal efficiency. Allied pilots often described seeing an Fw-190 fire as witnessing a sudden explosion of light and destruction. Production began in 1941, and as more aircraft reached the front lines, the Luftwaffe quickly realized they had something extraordinary. The Fw-190 was not just a fighter, it was adaptable. Engineers soon began modifying it for multiple roles: interceptor, bomber escort, ground attack aircraft, and even bomber-destroyer. Few aircraft in the war would prove as versatile. What Kurt Tank had created was not merely a machine. It was a philosophy of warfare translated into metal and firepower, a belief that victory belonged not to the most delicate design, but to the aircraft that could endure the violence of the battlefield and still strike back. Part 3: A Terror in the Channel Front. By 1942, the skies over the English Channel had become one of the most dangerous airspaces in the world. Allied bombers and reconnaissance aircraft crossed the narrow stretch of water almost daily, while German fighters patrolled the French coastline waiting to intercept them. It was here that the Fw-190 revealed just how lethal it could be. Rough pilots flying Spitfire MKV aircraft quickly realized they were facing something new and deeply unsettling. In combat reports, pilots described an enemy fighter that could accelerate away from them in a dive and outroll them in close combat. Attempts to pursue often ended with a German aircraft flipping suddenly into a new position, guns flashing before the British pilot could react. Dogfights became chaotic dances of speed and instinct. The Fw-190 thrived in this environment. Its powerful engine allowed it to climb rapidly and strike from above, while its heavy armament meant that even a short attack window could destroy an enemy aircraft. German pilots adopted aggressive tactics, diving into Allied formations, firing devastating bursts, and climbing away before escorts could respond. For bomber crews, the experience was even worse. American and British bomber formations flying daylight missions across occupied Europe suddenly faced a new predator. Fw-190s would approach at high speed, unleash cannon fire into bomber formations, and vanish through the defensive gunfire before escorts could intercept them. The aircraft's armor and engine durability meant that it could sometimes survive hits that would destroy lighter fighters. The Luftwaffe began deploying specialized Fw-190 units designed specifically to attack bombers. Some variants carried even heavier weapons, including 30mm cannons capable of tearing apart the massive American B-17 Flying Fortress. In those moments of attack, the sky became a place of terrifying violence. Bomber crews described seeing German fighters rushing toward them through clouds of tracer fire, wings trembling under the recoil of their cannons. One burst was often enough to cripple an aircraft. Yet for all its ferocity, the Fw-190 was not invincible. The Allies responded quickly. Engineers studied captured examples of the aircraft, learning its strengths and weaknesses. New versions of the Spitfire, particularly the Spitfire Mk9, were rushed into service specifically to counter the Fw-190's performance advantage. The aerial arms race intensified. But for a time during those critical months in 1942, the Fw-190 ruled the Channel front. Its presence reshaped tactics, forced redesigns of Allied aircraft, and reminded every pilot flying over Europe that the war in the sky was far from decided. Part 4: The multi-role Predator. By the middle years of the war, the Fw-190 had evolved into something rare in military aviation, a fighter that could excel in almost every role demanded of it. While many aircraft were designed for a single purpose: interception, escort, or ground attack, the Fw-190 proved capable of performing all of them. German engineers began modifying the aircraft into multiple specialized variants. Some versions focused on high-altitude interception, while others were built specifically for ground attack. One of the most feared versions was the Fw-190 F and G series, designed to support German ground forces on the Eastern Front. There, the aircraft became a nightmare for Soviet tanks and troop formations. Flying low over vast battlefields, Fw-190 pilots attacked armored columns, artillery positions, and supply convoys. The aircraft could carry bombs and rockets while still retaining the maneuverability of a fighter. Its rugged construction allowed it to survive heavy ground fire that would cripple more delicate aircraft. Pilots often described flying through walls of smoke, dust, and exploding shells while hunting targets below. Soviet soldiers learned to recognize the distinctive roar of the radial engine, a sound that often meant destruction was seconds away. The Fw-190 was equally feared in the West. As Allied bombing campaigns intensified, the aircraft became one of the primary defenders of German airspace. Interceptor versions armed with heavy cannons attacked bomber formations with brutal determination. Some pilots even used experimental weapons such as air-to-air rockets designed to break apart bomber formations before closing for cannon fire. But as the war dragged on, the strategic situation for Germany grew increasingly desperate. Allied fighter escorts improved dramatically, and new aircraft such as the P-51 Mustang began accompanying bombers deep into German territory. The skies grew more crowded, more dangerous, and far more lethal. Yet even in those worsening conditions, the Fw-190 remained one of the most formidable aircraft in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. Its adaptability allowed it to serve wherever German commanders needed it most, from the frozen battlefields of the Eastern Front to the burning skies above German cities. Few aircraft embodied the brutal versatility of World War II aviation as completely as the Fw-190. Part 5: A duel of machines. By 1943 and 1944, the air war over Europe had become a colossal industrial struggle. Aircraft production soared on both sides. Every new fighter represented thousands of hours of engineering, manufacturing, and training. The Fw-190 now faced a growing list of enemies, each designed to counter its strengths. The Spitfire Mk9 restored balance in the skies over Europe. American P-47 Thunderbolts proved tough enough to challenge German fighters in brutal high-altitude combat. And when the P-51 Mustang entered the war in large numbers, the strategic landscape shifted again. The Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. For the first time, German fighters could no longer rely on striking bombers without facing long-range escorts. Air battles became enormous swirling conflicts involving dozens, sometimes hundreds, of aircraft. Within that chaos, the Fw-190 still demonstrated remarkable capabilities. Its roll rate and firepower made it deadly in close combat, while experienced German pilots used energy tactics, the rapid dives and climbs to control engagements. Some of the Luftwaffe's greatest aces flew the Fw-190 with devastating skill. Pilots like Walter Nautny and Otto Kittel scored dozens of victories while flying the aircraft on the Eastern Front. In the West, experienced fighter leaders used the Fw-190 to intercept Allied bombers and engage escort fighters in violent aerial battles that could last for minutes or seconds depending on who gained the advantage. But the war's momentum was shifting. By late 1944, Allied air superiority had grown overwhelming. German pilots faced massive formations of bombers escorted by long-range fighters. Fuel shortages limited training, and experienced veterans were increasingly replaced by younger, less prepared pilots. The Fw-190 remained a formidable aircraft, but machines alone cannot win wars. Part 6: A Twilight of the Butcher Bird. By the final months of World War II, the skies above Germany had become a graveyard of aircraft. Allied bombers crossed the country almost daily, escorted by fighters that filled the horizon. German pilots climbed into their aircraft knowing that survival was increasingly unlikely. The Fw-190 continued to fight until the end. New versions such as the Fw-190, nicknamed the Dora, introduced a longer nose and improved high-altitude performance. These aircraft were among the last piston-engine fighters capable of challenging Allied escorts in the desperate final defense of Germany. But the strategic situation was already decided. Factories were destroyed. Fuel supplies dwindled. Airfields were bombed repeatedly. Even the most capable aircraft could not overcome those realities. And yet the Fw-190 never lost its reputation. Allied pilots who fought against it often described it with a mixture of respect and caution. It was a fighter that demanded attention. Under the control of a skilled pilot, it remained one of the most dangerous aircraft in the sky. Thousands were built during the war. Many were destroyed in combat. Others were abandoned on shattered airfields as the war collapsed around them. Today, only a handful remain. But their story is not merely about machines. The Fw-190 represents a moment in history when engineering brilliance collided with the brutal realities of global war. It was a weapon born from ambition, perfected in combat, and remembered for the fear it inspired in those who faced it. In the vast sky of World War II aviation, the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 remains one of the most formidable predators ever built.